Hello everyone, and thank you for attending. The stream will begin in another 2 minutes. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's event, Double-Blinded and Blindsided, a lecture on the challenges faced in the surgical research landscape over the past year. My name is Mayuri Ramnarain, and I am a fourth-year medical student at the University of Pretoria. This lecture is the culmination of collaborative efforts by the Tuks Student Surgical Society, the Tuks Undergraduate Research Forum, and the Wits Students Surgical Society. The COVID-19 pandemic has challenged almost every aspect of medicine and daily living. Tonight, Professor Martin Brand and Dr. Gabriella Hyman will explore its impact on academic surgery and surgical research. We will also unpack the role of the clinician scientist and discuss opportunities for aspiring researchers. As the head of the research committee at the Tuks Student Surgical Society, I would like to say a few words about the organization. TSSS was founded in March 2016 and strives to primarily advance the science and arts of surgery, to provide adequate opportunities and to promote the development of basic surgical skills necessary at an undergraduate level and for future general practice. To get in touch, please make use of our website and email address. I would now like to introduce Michael Stark from the Tuks Undergraduate Research Forum.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Stark, and I am the student chairperson of the Tuks Undergraduate Research Forum, which is also called in short TURF. Our main goal at TURF is to encourage undergraduate students to get involved in research. And as many of you know, your research journey only really begins once you start your postgraduate. However, at TURF, we believe this should not be the case, and research should be instilled into the minds of all undergraduate students. We offer undergraduate students the opportunity to either start their own research project or to become involved in an existing study. TURF also offers students the opportunity to join and participate in workshops and webinars held from some of the world's leading scientists in order to motivate and give you guys some good guidelines and tips that you can use throughout your scientific career. Thanks, everyone. Prof. Bunt, you can start preparing your slides.
Thank you, Michael. I would now like to introduce Amy van Drushen from the Wits Students Surgical Society.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. As mentioned, my name is Amy van Druten. I'm the current president of the Wits Student Surgical Society. It's a pleasure to be able to co-host this evening tonight and have you join us virtually. While we have often said at our other events how unfortunate it is that we are not yet able to gather in person for these evenings, The pandemic has actually made this one very possible. If it were not for the way we have become accustomed to online interface over the past year and a half, I highly doubt that I would be addressing both Tuks and Wits students together tonight, and maybe even others. The Wits Student Surgical Society was founded in 2010 and has since enjoyed 10 exciting years exploring the world of surgery and what it has to offer aspiring healthcare students. I would encourage anyone wishing to get involved with us to please have a browse through our website as well as our Instagram profile and simply send us a direct message should you wish to contact us. We are currently involved in a Women's Month outreach campaign and soon to enter into a Smile Month for the Smile Foundation. We have also enjoyed the return of our suturing workshops this year and the continuation of our online events, all of which can be rewatched via our YouTube channel. Simply search Wits Surgical Society. We are a passionate group of students who really enjoy sharing our love for all things surgical with our fellow students and doctors. We are appreciative every day of the opportunities we have to enter into such collaborations with TSSS and TURF and their like-minded students. Thank you again for joining us, and I sincerely hope you enjoy this evening. I will now hand back to Mayuri to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Amy. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Martin Brand. Professor Brand is an associate professor, the head of hepatopancreaticobiliary surgery, and chairman of the PhD committee at the University of Pretoria. He is also the current secretary of the College of Surgeons South Africa and chairman of the Federation of Surgeons of South Africa. Professor Brand, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mira. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you give me control so I can share my screen? Perfect. Okay, are you able to see my screen? Yeah, it's not giving the usual share screen option. When I share my desktop, the arrow is not changing. So I'm not sure if you've given me right to share screen. It's not allowing me to share. It's not the usual Teams where I can just click on it and then it gives me the option of sharing what I want to share. It says, we can do that. I'll email it now. It's just going to make it a bit challenging though, because it's an animated PowerPoint, but we can try. Okay, I've mailed it. Okay, let me just get back into Teams. Close that off. Let's have a look. No, it hasn't. You know what? Let me log off and log in again. Maybe that just needs to be done. I'll be back in a second. Okay, I don't have control anymore. I think let's try. No, yeah, there we go. Okay. So I can only use my arrow keys. Okay, cool. Yeah, let's give it a bash. Otherwise we're running. Cool. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and apologies for the technical issues. I don't normally have a problem with Teams. Yeah, so thanks to the two surgery societies as well as to TURF, and hopefully you get some value out of my presentation today. So my topic is on academic surgery, and the reason I chose that is I don't think one can really separate academics from research. So I'm going to cover both of those topics. So if we look into the literature or into the media, actually at the moment, there's a lot of publications that are coming out that are very similar to this topic about how the pandemic has actually forced universities to look at themselves, but also how destructive the pandemic has been to the functioning of tertiary institutions. And so this is just an example out of the UK, where if you read what's written in the quote there, is because there's large losses of income, and in the UK they're highly dependent on foreign students who pay school fees, etc., for their income. In South Africa, it's slightly different in the sense that, yes, we do have high income from students, etc., but we also have significant government subsidies. So in our country, the government subsidies have been decreased quite significantly. But this has resulted in universities in the UK having to look at how they're going to actually survive financially so that they can carry on functioning as a tertiary institution. And often they have to either stop hiring new staff or even let excess staff go. They've had to terminate short-term contracts, And these kind of contracts are people who often provide cleaning services and things like that. They've had to drop certain courses that are not very popular, and they've even dropped some degree programs that are not as popular as others. And in extreme cases, they've ended up as closing departments. This is probably something a little bit more closer to home. This is a publication that actually included sub-Saharan Africa. And it also, again, just speaks to the fact about what the pandemic has done to tertiary education. And what they did find in their study is that poorer students and institutions that were already vulnerable before the pandemic have been far worse affected than obviously more well-established and richer institutions. It's also been found that students who cannot afford cell phones and laptops or data and airtime have obviously going to be severely disadvantaged by the new form of teaching that we have, which is online tuition. Also, students have been forced to go back home. Hostels have closed, university villages have been evacuated, etc. And so they return home, where they're often expected to take part in the daily activities and whatever needs to be done at home. And some of the environments obviously are not as good as other environments. So that will obviously be a significant inhibition to how one learns. An example is given also in Malaysia that 44% of their higher education institutions are currently technically insolvent. And that was in February of this year, which is so nearly 50% of universities in Malaysia are really under the quash. Australian universities are also not much better off. In Australia, we would obviously consider as a very well-developed country. And they've also had to start slashing their what they call non-core costs. And unfortunately, non-core costs are often funds that they put aside to help assist with research, etc. And again, very similar to the UK, what we saw there. So what I'm going to try to cover today is I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then we're going to speak a little bit on the impact on teaching. We're going to speak a lot about the impact on research, and then I'll make a conclusion which hopefully won't be as negative as most of my talk will sound. So with the pandemic, all forms of teaching actually has come to an end. It's not just tertiary education. So elementary and secondary schools were forced to be closed. Universities had to cancel in-person lectures, and so the lecture halls were empty and universities were forced to go online. And this was no different for medical education. Undergraduate medical education was suspended, and especially suspended clinical training. And to large degrees in our country, that hasn't come back as what it was before. And obviously, postgraduate medical education training had to cancel in-person teaching. And that also affects obviously clinical training, but also the lectures and the TUTs that you get, the skills courses, etc. Going further than medical students is our surgical registrars, and they've also been affected by all of the above in the sense that they don't really get formal lectures, but they do have a lot of tutorials, and those have also been put on the back burner. But the major issue for surgical people wanting to train is that there's been a massive reduction in volume of surgery. And now almost 2 years down the road, we still have not seen an increase in volume. And even if, for example, you were in Steve Biko Academic Hospital, our clinics are still effectively closed, and our wards haven't been opened completely either. So the impact on teaching. So if we just look at a very reliable source in Wikipedia, the definition of medical practice is that you require both textbook knowledge, so in other words, a detailed knowledge of the disciplines that you need to practice as a doctor. You need a sound knowledge of anatomy and physiology and obviously the underlying diseases. There's also a science of it, and the science really comes by applying the physiology and the underlying disease to the patient that you have in front of you and coming up with a diagnosis and treatment plan. But you also, to be able to do that, you need competence in the application or the art and craft of medicine. So if we look at it, what COVID has effectively done to us is that it has completely abolished the application of practice for you guys as medical students. The book knowledge one can learn through online teaching, but the actual application or the practice of the craft of medicine, and that is something that you're missing out on completely. And obviously the final years and the fifth years that are coming in are the ones that are greatly affected by this. And it's not just at our institutions, it's across the country. This is a very interesting article, which was actually written by a medical student. It's an American publication, and it's how the pandemic made it harder to become a doctor. And there's two aspects to this. So one thing that the pandemic has done with universities having to cut costs, etc., is that getting actually access to get into a medical school has become far more competitive, not because the standards of the students who are applying are higher or the standards of the university has been increased, but the fact that they have less space to accommodate students. So what one must remember is that your school fees that you're paying for each year of medical school does not cover the full cost of your education, and that it's significantly subsidized. And that's not only common in America, it's also common in South Africa and in other countries as well. The other side of it is obviously the clinical exposure that you're getting. So you're getting less training that you require as a doctor. So that's why it's becoming harder to become a doctor. First of all, it's difficult to get in, and second of all, it's difficult to actually acquire all the skills that you need. So if we look at the medical education, effectively we can divide it into two components. So the first component is a university-based preclinical phase where you get your lectures, you have to learn out of the textbooks, and pretty much it's just learning theory. The second is the more fun bit, which is the clinical phase, where you're actually working in healthcare environments, where you're getting to interact with patients, you're seeing other doctors work with patients, you're seeing investigations being done, you're seeing results, and you're seeing the management of the patient. What COVID has done is that by exploiting the fact that it spreads through human contact, we've had to stop human contact. And that has resulted in the following equation, that medical students will at the moment have adequate theoretical knowledge, because we didn't know that medical students are obviously capable of learning and learning independently. However, it is at the expense of adequate practical exposure. And that is really the challenge that we now face going forward this year and the next years coming forward. There are additional issues which have been identified internationally, but most of these are also applicable to our South African environment. Initially, there was absolutely no access to clinical platforms. And then once the platforms reopened and we knew how to manage COVID with social distancing, etc., access was then severely limited. Obviously, we can only have so many people around a patient's bed. Obviously, we can only have so many people in the patient's examination room in a clinic. We can only have so many people in the theatre to watch the operation that is being performed. Also, trainers have had to prioritize clinical duties, and usually clinical trainers are clinicians. They are surgeons or they're physicians, etc., and they do the teaching on the side. But now with the overwhelming burden of the COVID patients that we have to look after and the limited number of clinicians that we have, and because especially in South Africa, universities are not responsible for our salaries, the Department of Health pays our salaries, we obviously have to prioritize where we work, and unfortunately the university will always come second there. So what this has resulted in is that there's a lot more self-study that is expected of a medical student, and I'm sure that's what you've come across. Case-based learning sessions haven't really been implemented as broadly as we would have liked to. Probably I can really only speak here for Pretoria, but I'm not aware of this being actually successful throughout our country. Some universities overseas have started virtual operating rooms. These are phenomenally expensive to do, and again, not really readily available in our country. Online clinical science review sessions. So this is really where medical students are invited to take part in online multidisciplinary team meetings, where in the past you would have had a meeting between the clinicians, and that's a multidisciplinary team. So maybe you would have had surgeons and oncologists and radiologists and maybe intensivists in the same room, and patient cases would be discussed. We don't really have that, and it occurs in a lot more limited session, limited space, and it's also now done in a lot more expedient fashions. But that is probably one of the platforms where one should invite medical students to. However, there are issues around that, and I'll come to those shortly. And then what they've started doing, primarily in America, but it's now picking up in the UK as well, is getting virtual patient contacts. And this is where a patient is seen by a doctor, they have their consultation with that doctor, they get treated, and then the patient is asked to stay behind so that the medical student or students can do the same interview and interaction with the patient. And then the medical doctor joins at the end and sees what the medical students present and listens to them and then gives them guidance on that. That's obviously very challenging because the patient needs to agree to it. And now they're effectively having a double consultation, which many patients are obviously not very keen on. In South Africa, this is also very challenging because now it means that our patients that we see need to be able to log into some form of a virtual platform, and the majority of our patients are not able to do that. So this is what a medical university in Florida came up with. And at the time of publication, this university had pretty much completely closed its clinical platforms to medical students. So their final year medical students were given absolutely no access to examine patients or to even set foot in their hospital. So this is a publication that they then made about what they thought of as an online or a virtual final year medical training, a build up to final year medical training. And as you can see, self-study, case-based learning was a large part of it. You've got clinical science review sessions that they build in, and then they list the types of students that should be there. They initiated remote check-ins or interviews, and then also what they identified as patients that were supposed to come in for elective surgical procedures that were cancelled. They were asked whether or not they would be willing to be virtual dummies for medical students, and this was all done during office hours. They also identified that obviously the medical students were not seeing patients with acute pathologies, so they came up with what they call sample illness scripts. So this is an example of one of them, which is appendicitis. And the idea here was that the medical students would be given this, for example, on a Monday, and they were then given until maybe the Thursday to work their way through this. And everything that's on this script, they would need to either go and research, and they were given a list of resources that were recommended, and they could go read or watch YouTube videos, etc. And on the Thursday, they would then have almost a formal tutorial with one of the surgeons, and then they would go through this. And this would be done in place of actually seeing a live patient with acute appendicitis in the emergency rooms. And this they applied for almost over a year. So this is one of the options, I guess, although, again, I'm not quite sure how this is better than reading a textbook, but I guess it puts everything together. This is a systematic review of how virtual medical teaching has been effective during COVID, again, published in 2020. So the strengths that this study identified is that there is a huge variety of web-based resources that are available. Unfortunately, the better ones all require a subscription, but the better off universities are able to actually buy those kind of subscriptions. And then that really does make a lot of online teaching a lot easier because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Interactive forms of virtual teaching are being developed, but this is still very experimental because we've never needed to do this in the past. But there are very different interactive formats, and some of them are interactive in the sense of like what we're doing today, or there are interactive formats where you have a mannequin and you need to then describe how you would examine the mannequin, and the mannequin responds to your commands, etc. Open access teaching with medical experts has increased exponentially. And again, this is probably a good example in this meeting where now you've got students from at least 2 different medical institutions that have access to a medical expert, whereas normally only that single institution would have had it. So it's a huge advantage of open access of virtual teaching. Peer mentoring has proven to be a valuable tool for students, and mentoring really here also means support for them. Again, one needs established mentoring programs existing before the pandemic to be able to institute these, and these are available in our country to different degrees during the different departments. The weaknesses of online or virtual teaching is obviously there's technical challenges, as what we saw at the beginning of my presentation, that I wasn't able to share my own presentation. There are confidentiality issues, and these are huge. So this is where the virtual interactions with the patients come in, where confidentiality cannot necessarily be guaranteed. And there was that issue around Zoom meetings about a year ago where people could actually join Zoom meetings even though you weren't necessarily invited to it. And that obviously has a huge implication for if it's a patient talking about their own personal medical issues. Reduced student engagement is a massive weakness because now I'm talking to a screen. I cannot see any of you, so I can't see who's sleeping and who's smiling and who's putting faces at me. But I also can't see the engagement of, are you actually grasping what I'm talking about or not? Because that is something that we as teachers often rely on in the lecture halls, is you can really see if students are actually following what's going on in the lecture or if they're not, or they're able to put up their hands and say, I'm sorry, I don't understand that concept, or it doesn't doesn't make sense. That kind of engagement has been really limited in virtual teaching. And loss of assessment, which maybe for you guys is seemingly is not a huge issue, but it actually is a huge issue, because the way we used to assess, we were able to adapt how we were assessing. If we did a live assessment, etc., one can't do that. One now has to go and use, unfortunately, tools such as MCQs and short answer kind of questions. It's very difficult to do other forms of assessment that we could actually do at the bedside, and maybe one could see how you examine the patient and interact with you. And that form of assessment has unfortunately disappeared completely. And then, of course, the mental well-being of students has been negatively affected, and I'm going to show you a study that shows that quite clearly. And there's obviously the inequalities, and part of it is what I alluded to earlier, is that if you don't have access or reliable access to the internet, you're obviously going to be massively disadvantaged, because you do need to have good access to internet. And in our country, as we saw, that's quite a challenge. So how has it affected our students in our country? So what it has done, it really has exposed the flaws in medical school or medical student training platforms. And what I mean there is that universities in our country very rarely pay the salaries of the clinicians that do medical student training. I think UCT is probably one of the few examples where heads of departments are actually university appointees, whereas the rest of the staff are Department of Health appointees. Most other universities, everyone is appointed by the Department of Health. So obviously when there's a pandemic, you have to honor your job, which is actually looking after patients, whereas our joint appointment with the university then will severely come second. And I'm quite sure our students in Pretoria can attest to that. So the problem is that clinicians are trainers. So there's a very limited pool of trainers. And as I said before, the university doesn't have their own clinical trainers. The traditional face-to-face and bedside teaching was always our dominant way of teaching, especially in the final year of medical school, where you have a patient with a pathology, and you really are able to give a very effective tutorial around that pathology at the patient's bedside, looking into their file, then discussing the management around that patient, and that really reinforces book knowledge. And unfortunately, that has fallen away in the last 18 months, 2 years. Unfortunately, also the trainers have had very little training in virtual teaching methods. And we've had no time to learn about them, or virtually no time to learn about them. So what that has meant is that the quality of virtual teaching is probably a lot less than what live teaching would have been. And we are only really in this year, I would say, in this year, in my experience, is we're already beginning to capture on how one can do effective virtual teaching. And of course, we have very little training in remote assessment. And as I said before, remote assessment is also very difficult. And that's what I've already said before. So what is going to result in at the moment is that interns and ComServe doctors have adequate book knowledge, but they have limited experience with the application of the book knowledge, which is really key for a very practical discipline such as medicine and especially surgery. We have also very limited experience in dealing with patients. Reading a textbook and seeing the signs and symptoms and reading it there and recognizing what the condition is very easy, but getting that history out of that patient can be very difficult. And some patients are very forthcoming with the information and others are very difficult. And you need to, it really is an art to tease out what you want to get out of that inpatient. And that experience is very limited. You've also got limited exposure of what it is like to be a doctor. When you're in the wards, you see how the interns behave, how they treat patients, how they work with the nurses, how they work with their senior colleagues. And that is something that is very important because it instills in you how you should be going about your job. And you unfortunately don't have that. So this is the meta-analysis I was talking about earlier. So it's a meta-analysis which looked at suicidal ideation. And as we know, suicidal ideation is fairly... Sorry, apologies. Let me just have a quick cough. So there are several studies out there which shows that medical students, amongst all students in a university, do seem to have a higher suicide ideation than others. And this has just been escalated during the pandemic. Academic stress is a predictor of mental health, and academic stress amongst medical students, especially by the fact that you realize you don't have that hands-on exposure to patients, and hence academic stress at the moment is much increased amongst medical students. Okay, I'm not able to change my why. There we go. So what that stress is also a part of the factors because you're less prepared to function as a doctor. You also have fewer available resources with less experience on how to use those resources. And that's especially going to come into being now in the public sector, which is the academic environment, is we're seeing that our hospitals are less and less able to afford resources because they've been plowing so much into fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and the huge costs of PPEs and managing patients that have COVID in the ICUs, etc. The funds that are available to look after non-COVID patients are decreasing rapidly. And so the resources around those patients are also decreasing. However, one would expect that in 2 or 3 years' time, these kind of resources should be supplemented again and back to normal. And if you've qualified in medicine now, you may not be aware of all the resources that you should have. There's obviously a potential for greater burnout because now you have to work a lot harder to become a doctor because you need a lot more book knowledge. And also there's a potential slower career progression because you are going to need to learn certain skills before you can get into surgery type jobs, etc. And at the moment, for example, if you're a medical officer applying for a surgical registrar post, your logbooks won't be growing much because you're not doing much operating. And when you come to the interview for the surgical reg post, one of the things that we definitely look at is how much experience do you have operating and what kind of operations have you done. So if we look at surgical registrars, and this is overseas, so there are several studies that have been published, but what I found quite interesting preparing for this talk is what the American Board of Surgery has done. And they've realized that if they don't change their graduation requirements, they're going to have less surgeons qualifying. And that's a problem in America where they actually have a shortage of surgeons. So what their solution was is that they've reduced their annual work from 44 to 48 weeks. So they've taken 1 month out of each year of training. So effectively, they've reduced surgical training by 5 months. They've reduced their surgical logbook requirements by at least 20%. And they've increased the amount of time that they expect their surgical trainees to work in a simulation center. They expect them to join video conferences, and these video conferences are actually centralized video conferences supplied by the American College of Surgeons. And again, that's a huge infrastructure to put something like that in place. And then obviously they expect their local training in their academic departments where they are training to continue, and that obviously needs to include the M&M meetings, which we have, and the didactic sessions, but that they have to be done on a virtual platform. So this is a nice study. It's a Canadian study that was published, and they also looked at the registrars. And so what they found, hang on, that was not me. Okay. Okay, so in this, they looked at 12 months worth of surgical, they call them fellows, but the equivalent in our country would be surgical registrars. So throughout Canada, over 400,000 elective surgical cases were cancelled in 1 year because of COVID. So what they then did is they allowed training extensions. So instead of their training being 5 years, they're now allowing 6 years. And that's not to the detriment of the candidate, and they've allowed them an extra year of a salaried position. They've realized that there's minimum patient contact. So the Canadian Department of Health has actually got in and started also subsidizing surgical simulation laboratories. It would be great if our country would be able to do that. So that clearly Canada is a financially resourced country. And the fellows that they also found that the registrars had a lot of stress because they lost research productivity, conferences were being cancelled, and clinical research was suspended. And so that requirement at the moment has also been suspended for them. If they can prove that they were doing research before the pandemic, it is accepted as if they had completed the research. So where are we going now with teaching? So various documents have been released. This is one that was released in the UK. However, if one actually starts reading them, and I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but if you briefly glimpse over it, it really states the obvious, and it doesn't give any solutions. So restarting effective research, but how is one going to start effective research? Project evolution needs to continue, or they may no longer be feasible, but what are they going to be replaced with? And in the same document, they've got actions for universities and research instruments. However, these are very non-specific and don't really help individuals at all. I mean, to provide support and mentorship, how is that going to help? I mean, that exists already, etc. So there's nothing in concrete. So at the moment, there is no real answer to that question. If we look at the impact on research, so research activity had to be completely redefined. So all non-essential research had to be stopped during the pandemic. So if we look at Florida State University, they came out with a formal instruction. So what they identified as research that needed to continue was anything that had to do with COVID-19. And if it was a clinical research study in which these are usually drug studies, if they would be stopped, they would harm patients. So they had to continue, but that's a very small part of clinical research. And if there was the viability of living organisms that would come to an end. So for example, if animal studies were ongoing, or if you had cell lines that were growing, those had to continue, but no new studies could be started. And if there was activity that was required for the safe maintenance of specific equipment, so maybe -70 freezers or equipment like that, that was allowed. And yeah, that's pretty much what I said. So let's go to the next slide. So the feasibility of research environments. So wet laboratory work, so any work that requires work with machinery in a lab. So you're doing ELISAs or flow cytometry or anything, or cell culturing, those kind of work could not be done remotely, and so they had to be stopped. Computational dry laboratory research could be performed remotely. So what we did see is in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a whole host of publications that were coming out, and that's because people all of a sudden had time to sit back, analyze data, and write publications. But once they'd analyzed all their data and written their publications, they weren't able to go back to the laboratory to start doing new experiments. And so that's why we're now seeing a real downturn in the research output internationally. Clinical studies can definitely not be done remotely, and cell culture studies really ran under quash here. So for example, there was a cell science institute in Seattle which had to then freeze hundreds of cell lines. So they might be growing cancer cell lines and doing research on those. What they found when they came back to the laboratory and they thawed the cells, over 50% of those cells had died. So that's a huge loss for those laboratories and has really been a setback for them. If we look at animal research, just the pure mechanics of COVID has resulted in disruption of supply chains. So even basic things like animal food and bedding and veterinary drugs were not being delivered because they weren't allowed to be transported. There were other areas where animals had to be culled because they weren't being used. So in Pennsylvania, there's a laboratory that is known for growing, or not really growing. What would be the right word for that? Allowing animals to multiply and then use them for science. So they had to cull over 3/4 of their animals. So that's, first of all, a huge financial loss to that institution, but it also sets back anyone who wants to do research or had ordered those animals to do research on, because once you come back online, you obviously have to get the animals back, and that obviously takes a lot of time. In Germany, for example, over 1,000 animals were also culled because obviously there was no research being done. So they had to cull those animals. Again, once research starts, those animals have to reproduce and get their numbers again, and that takes a lot of time. But we don't only look at those kind of animals. In China, there was a laboratory that actually did a lot of research on fruit flies, and so they had to, all of their fruit flies died because of their lockdown, and so they are actually now unable to function because they don't have a single fruit fly that's still alive. So the impact on researchers themselves, so especially early career and PhD students were the hardest hit because they're the ones that have to have an output and show an output to show that they are going to be successful or complete their theses so that they can move on in their careers. So the PhD students rely on funding, and often their funding comes with very tight time constraints. And in many cases, these time constraints were not increased, so they would then lose their fellowships. And just the complete loss of productivity set back PhD students specifically. So in other words, this is obviously going to result in a career progression for these early career researchers. similar to what I said with young medical doctors. So there is and the reason for the delay in career progression is publications are failing because obviously you don't have research that you can write up. Funding becomes an issue because funding runs out because it's time limited. In many cases, funding is also based on if you don't use it in a specific time period, you have to relinquish it. You're not able to network because you can't meet, and that's very important for researchers. You need to get your name out there. You need to see what other laboratories are doing, and you need to see where else you can go and get work once you've finished your various research jobs that you're doing currently. And also universities, as I said in the first few slides, there were job cuts and hiring freezes. Funding was a massive problem, and we see this especially in South Africa as well. So this is not just a first world problem. So there are some examples which are actually quite horrific. So if you look at cancer research in the United Kingdom, they cut £44 million of funding in April 2020. That's a huge amount of money that's been taken away from cancer research. Okay, that was not me. If we look at the British Heart Foundation, 50% of their income for research was cut. So in other words, they used to get in around about £100 million a year. They went down to £50 million at the beginning of this year. So you can just imagine the implications of that is for the researchers that rely on that kind of money. It really is going to set them back. And in America, similar kind of thing. £12.4 billion worth of money has also been lost there. It's a bit strange that they're putting that in pounds and not in dollars. But anyway. Gender equality is another issue that is really raised, and obviously has been a huge problem, especially in research environments many years ago, but we're finally managing to get on board so that we have a lot more women in prominent research roles. However, the pandemic has set us back in there as well. And so there are quite a few studies that are being published recently on this, and it shows that females are far more likely to have to shoulder the responsibility of looking after children and taking on homeschooling compared to their male counterparts. And this is especially true in countries where there are gender inequality. And we can really see that in our country or in our institution as well. It was really the female researchers that haven't been able to come back because they have been really burdened with home care and homeschooling. Female researchers are also far more likely, because of their familial commitments or their home commitments, to take on casual or short-term jobs. And these are the first jobs that universities will cut because of lack of funding. They're far less likely to cut someone who's on a permanent full-time job. So what it has done, it has widened what was a pre-existing gender gap that was becoming a lot smaller. It has re-widened probably, and it's probably worse than what it was 10 years ago. What's also notable is that the publications that are coming out at the moment, over 1/3 of those authors are only now female. And this really shows a marked underrepresentation. So if we look at how corona pandemic has affected surgical research. So this is another review. So this, not a review, this was a survey that was sent out to the Academic Surgery Association. They managed to get 301 people who are members of that to respond, and 70% of those people who responded said that the pandemic has significantly impacted and in a negative way on their research for reasons of the buildings being shut down due to lockdowns, minimized personnel being allowed into laboratories due to the social distancing requirements, and also the suspension of most animal work and clinical trials. Research productivity was initially maintained because they were able to focus on their remote work, they were able to write publications, they were able to write grant applications, and they were able to analyze data. However, once they'd gone through all of that, they had no new work, and that's why we're now seeing that decrease in research. So the question is, where are we going to go now? And again, we have these fabulous documents that are being published. I've decided again to quote our United Kingdom counterparts. So the National Institute for Health Research has provided us with a framework, and just like the academic counterparts, it is a very non-specific document that really doesn't give any form of guidance and really just speaks to logical principles, but doesn't tell us how to get to those logical principles. There's a very long And what they really did focus on a lot is about safety. And again, this just reemphasizes the fact of the exposure, the effect of the pandemic, that there's social distancing, that areas need specific policies around COVID-19, etc. And in some cases, PPE need to be worn, which makes research really difficult. And again, it doesn't give us a good guideline about how do we go back to normal research activities. So what there is a real realization that we need a paradigm shift in how we, first of all, teach medical education and how it is acquired. And we need to look at productivity strategies for both education and research. And even though it is writing and remote work and meetings, it's how do we go about doing wet lab research once you've analyzed all your data and continuing. And no one has been able to give us a really good answer about that. So my conclusion is that we are in a place in time where we have no answers. And unfortunately, we've got no one where we can turn to who's got experience to tell us what to do and how they got through it. Because at the moment, everyone is trying to get through it in their own way. And we haven't seen massive success stories that we can say, right, we need to replicate that model. And no one can predict what is coming next. Is it going to be another wave? Is it going to be another 2 waves? Is the next wave going to be worse than the third wave? So there's no correct way to teach at the moment. There's no correct way to do research. However, what this shows also is that the opportunities are massive. And this is where I wanted to finish off on a positive note. If you stand back and look at it, there are huge gaps that are now opening up because people are moving on, leaving research laboratories, looking for other fields to work in. So the opportunities now are definitely huge to get into research, to get the basics, get the principles down, because the pandemic is not going to go on forever. We are going to go back eventually to some form of normality. Laboratories are going to have to open up. And when they do, if you've got the groundwork laid and your enthusiasm is there, the opportunities there are going to be huge. And what it means is that there's going to be the divide between the enthusiastic learner or researcher is just going versus the non-enthusiastic learner or researcher is just going to widen. So if you're really passionate about surgery, yes, at the moment it is frustrating, etc., but give it a bit of time. Do the groundwork, do the theory, practice, look at videos. If you can use a simulator, use a simulator. The opportunities are going to be there. So success is actually really in your hands, and literally it is in your hands. You are the driver of how much work you're going to put into it, because we are no longer able to hold a shambuk over you while you're sitting in that lecture hall and force you to read something. It's completely up to you how much work you're going to put in to achieve your success. So my advice, grab it. This is an opportunity. In a couple of years' time, you can look at it and say, this was the best thing ever that happened to your medical career, because you had the time to get the foundation and now you're reaping the rewards of it. Good. So that's my last slide. And then I have a whole host of references. So I think, Mayuri, you can stop the screen share.
Much, Professor Brand. We have a few questions for you.
Okay.
So the first question is, how can the field of surgery increase the integration of technology into research and clinical practice?
That's a complicated one. Oh, okay, how can the field of surgery? Well, actually, surgery is being forced. So surgery has been modern to a degree in the sense that we use fancy gadgets in theatre, especially with laparoscopic surgery and now 3D surgery. But what it didn't do, and now it's being forced to do, is look at novel ways of teaching and bringing across messages, and now looking at ways of how do you train people, because you're limited by the number of people that can be around your theatre table due to social distancing, for example. And so we're coming up with novel ways of doing it. So for example, in our department, we've put in really a state-of-the-art video system into our 2 theatres in level 6 into 15 and 14, where we're now able to transmit in very high resolution and high definition what we're actually doing in theatre. And we've put in and especially in one theatre, we've put in a state-of-the-art sound system. So we're now actually able to all of a sudden operate around a patient, but everyone in our lecture room or in our touch room, seminar room, is actually able to see what it is. So what I'm saying is the pandemic has forced us to modernize our way of teaching. And I think that's one of the ways that we're going to be integrating with modern research, etc., because everything is becoming virtual. And so that's forcing us to become virtual.
Thank you so much. And the second question is a sort of follow-up. Is there a fear of artificial intelligence and robotic surgery overtaking the traditional approach? And if so, how can we approach this in the future?
Yeah, that is a nice question there. So, yeah, how to answer it. So if we look at robots nowadays in theatres, so if you look at, for example, the Da Vinci system, and now that the Da Vinci patent has expired, there are other robots that are coming onto the market. So robots are going to become a lot cheaper. But a robot is still worked by a surgeon. So in that way, it's just learning a different type of surgical skill by working in a robot. And if you go overseas nowadays, a lot of the surgical courses will include having sessions on the robot. So that is there. However, the enthusiasm for robot work is beginning to wane a little bit because the novelty of it has fallen away. And now that we've operated on so many different types of surgical procedures, we've defined the ones that are really effective, where a robot really works really well, and the increased cost is definitely worthwhile. But there are other procedures where it isn't. So an example would be if we look in the urology field, doing a total prostatectomy is a very effective thing for a robot to do. The space that we have around that prostate is limited. Seeing the nerves that you need to preserve, especially if you want to prevent erectile dysfunction, for example, it's far better doing that with a robot because you can clearly see them, whereas open surgery is very difficult. However, the robots that have been used to do, for example, a Whipple's procedure, there's been absolutely no benefit. The operations take a lot longer, the outcomes are the same, but the expense is a lot more. So the desire to do robotic Whipples, for example, has waned completely, and the number of publications that we see around that has disappeared. If we're talking about robots performing surgery completely independently of a surgeon, so an example there would be, for example, what the US Army did in Iraq, where they had their surgeons in America, in the Pentagon, and their patients in the field in Iraq, and a robot was operating on them. So that is very limited in the sense that, first of all, there is a time lag, and also it is very difficult to deal with emergencies. So if there's a copious amount of bleeding, you need a few hands in the field, you need experienced hands in the field, and you need quick hands in the field to deal with that. And that's where a robot isn't effective at all. And that's why the American Army actually stopped using robots remotely in the field. So am I worried about that robot? No, I'm not. But maybe you guys need to be, because probably by the time you get there, they might be a bit different to what they are now.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a truly fascinating presentation. I'm now going to hand over to Dominic to introduce Dr. Hannon.
Great, thank you for that very kind introduction, Dominic. Can everybody see the screen? Great. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me back to Wits. It's really great to be back, and I'm excited to speak about topics about which I'm very passionate, that being global surgery and clinical research. I've been asked to speak to you tonight about quite a broad range of topics, all in the context of my experiences as a clinical scientist, or clinician scientist rather, during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's get started. So tonight I'll be broadly addressing the concept of global surgery, the role of clinician scientists, what I like to call the pandemic effect, and I'll provide you with some practical tips for advancing your research careers. I have no disclosures. So what is global surgery? Globally, the burden of surgical, anesthetic, and obstetric, and I'll be calling this SAO care, the burden of this disease remains largely unmet. And this public health crisis disproportionately affects developing countries like South Africa, which is in fact a high to middle income country. The core indicators of access to safe surgery are represented by these pillars on the right of the screen. These were established by the Lancet Commission on Global Surgery, which is really the sentinel paper in this field of work. These pillars have been compressed recently from 6 to 5 indicators, and they are access to care, in terms of patients living within 2 hours of facilities that can deliver surgical services. Service delivery, which is measured in terms of cases or operative procedures done per 100,000 population per year. We measure capacity in terms of surgical workforce density. We measure quality in terms of perioperative mortality rate. And we measure the cost of care in terms of direct and indirect out-of-pocket costs and impoverishing costs that are incurred by patients. I think the most important principle when thinking about global surgery is really that equity and quality in care are not mutually exclusive. And what that means is that it's not acceptable to provide the same but substandard service to the entire population. In terms of solutions to this problem, a national surgical anesthetic and obstetric, and I see I've made a mistake on my slides, I apologize, it should read NSOAP, has emerged as the policy framework to achieving these goals. And in South Africa, there is a task team that's committed to developing an MSOAP. So before I move on, and as Prof. Brand said, it's really difficult not to have feedback from the audience. I'm sure you're seeing from these core indicators, or starting to appreciate rather, that firstly, there's probably a really big problem. 2, the fact that surgery traverses conventional public health categories to include health systems issues, outcomes research, health economics, health informatics, basic sciences. And thirdly, that in South Africa, it's probably going to be really difficult to quantify and improve any and all of these indicators, right? So the diverse nature of the global surgery problem is why it requires a multidisciplinary and collaborative effort. I hope you're all starting to think about what sort of research could be done for all of this. We really need to tailor global surgery initiatives from research to the subsequent interventions to provide contextual solutions. And that's really where the niche or vacuum for the sort of research has developed. What we see in countries that have achieved success in terms of meeting global surgery goals, it's largely due to their focus but inclusive approaches. For example, in Nigeria, they altered the name of their MSOAP to include nurses because of the crucial role nurses play in the health system, and they've also prioritized pediatric surgery explicitly, unlike other countries. Right. So in South Africa, we face 3 core issues or contextual issues. And the first is historic and persistent inequality. This is socioeconomic largely. We have a dual health system where the expenditure doesn't necessarily reflect the burden of disease. And by that, I'm referring to the tension between the private and public sector. And we also have competing interests. And this speaks to public health tensions. And by that, I mean the quadruple burden of disease. And I'm sure you're all familiar with what I mean by that. What we've seen is that SAO care has been neglected relative to what we call priority programs in South Africa. And these are maternal and child health, infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, typically hypertension, COPD in our setting. And if you think about how much has been achieved in the last 10 years in terms of managing the HIV epidemic, think about the topics you've probably engaged with at med school, the PMTCT program, voluntary counseling and testing, the extensive antiretroviral treatment rollout programs, it all sort of makes me jealous as a researcher in surgery, because patients can wait hours for an emergency Caesar or days for an appendectomy, but they wait minutes for an ARV. And really, I don't say this to undermine these programs' significant gains, but rather to give you some context to the challenges we face in the global surgery community, especially in South Africa. What's also interesting, and I'm sure some of you have thought about this while I've been speaking, is that all these priority programs often require some sort of SAO care in some form to improve health. So, for example, you might be thinking of an oncology patient who requires surgical treatment that's either definitive or to play support or for palliation. So what do we need in South Africa? We need SAO capacity building, we need resource reallocation, and most importantly, we need to upscale, excuse me, I'll also take a drink of water. We need to upscale our surgical research infrastructure. And this allows us to enter into the graphic on the right of the screen, which is a cycle of health system strengthening. And I've identified the ability to measure problems, develop contextual solutions, implement those interventions, and reevaluate in an iterative process as this goal for research infrastructure development. At risk of making everyone even more concerned or depressed about the state of SAO care in South Africa, let's talk about the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic and just build on what Prof. Brand's spoken about. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really caused a major disruption in routine hospital service delivery, just as it did in your medical school training and in all academic training. And the major difference between the effect COVID's had on teaching to what it's had on patients or service delivery is that we've not been able to move all surgical services onto an online platform, as I'm sure you can appreciate. The robots have not yet reached that level of expertise. So in public health, there's a principle called the 3 delays model, and it describes barriers to accessing care. And I think it might be helpful to consider the effect of COVID or the COVID-19 pandemic on surgical services within this framework. So there are pre-hospital delays rather in seeking care, and these are what I've identified as health-seeking delays. I want you to think about why surgical patients may not have sought healthcare in the pandemic, and this is linked really to those health-seeking behaviors. Then there's the pre-hospital delay in reaching care, and that's the access delay. And this is linked to social determinants of health, economics, affordability, transport, things you may have learned or touched on in your public health blocks at med school. And here I'd ask you to think about how maybe ambulances were repurposed or used for transferring patients between facilities. Think about what happens to patients requiring an ICU bed. And now think about what happens to a patient with an acute abdomen or critical limb ischemia who's waiting at home for hours to access a hospital. Lastly is the in-hospital delay, the service provision delay. And I'm sure when you're doing your calls in the emergency units at the various hospitals, at Barra, the Gen, well, when the Gen was open, at Helen Joseph or at Steve Biko, Kalafong, Tembisa, you've noticed that once a patient arrives at a facility, that doesn't necessarily translate into immediate care. So how long does a patient wait for theatre? How long do they wait to go to the ward because they need a COVID swab or they require oxygen? Or there's not enough staff on the general surgery service. And think about then of the effect of cancelling elective procedures and what that may have on the system's backlog. To really think about how COVID affected SAO care delivery at each of these points, and I've given some examples underneath each, but I ask you to think about whose responsibility you think it is to identify these gaps and then address them. There were specific challenges that the pandemic posed to global surgery beyond the ones I've just discussed. Firstly, surgery now has another non-surgical public health priority with which to compete. Moreover, ongoing research has had to either adapt or be halted, at least initially. Now we're starting to see a slow return of research. And the reason for this was largely to minimize patient contact or physical contact with patient records, even something as what you'd think was as simple as taking informed consent. What's most intuitive is probably that clinical surgery, literally touching patients, was reduced even further, and this really compounded the burden of unmet need. But there were and there remain important opportunities for the global surgery movement, and this is what I call the pandemic effect. And I would like to touch on just a few of these that I've listed. Where we were able to optimize on the intense, we really were able to optimize on the intense interest from the general public on a health issue. And from within the healthcare community, we also saw an increased interest in research or in evidence, perhaps, from most people. And this helped us to develop health system robustness and conduct important research that concerned surgical outcomes, not necessarily explicitly related to COVID, but through studies like the global, COVID surge cancer, COVID surge week, and now COVID surge South Africa, which is currently in its last phases of data cleaning. We were really able to see how what surgical patients' experiences are in a health system. Also, basic sciences received an investment, mostly if it was pertaining to COVID and the rush to developing the vaccine. What also we found is we could push for PPE and sanitation facilities to try and improve things like surgical site infection, theatre resources, and this is really an opportunity that perhaps we hadn't considered for a while, at least at the beginning of the pandemic. Most importantly, I think we changed the way we collaborated and communicated. And just like the way you're hosting this collaborative webinar between two surgical societies, and I'm glad Amy mentioned this at the beginning, so we're all kind of thinking along the same lines, is that this was because of the urgent need to close the knowledge gap about COVID and its direct and indirect effects on surgery, and it's translated into improved collaboration and bridged to a small extent the global north and the global south. And these opportunities really are ongoing. So throughout my next couple of slides, I ask or encourage you to think about ways that you might be able to explore, contribute to these different opportunities. So that brings me to my personal area of interest, which I was asked to speak about, and my current work, and that's on the identification of critical indicators that affect SAO care provision and outcomes in the South African public sector. The goal of my work is to support South Africa's NSOAP development, and in so doing, identify collectible metrics for evaluating SAO care quality and delivery, provide sustainable health system strengthening in the process. And this is all made possible through a career track, which is called that of becoming a clinician scientist. So when I was a medical student, I don't think the concept of a clinician scientist was really advertised or discussed often, if ever. And I'm not sure if this will work in the way that this is being streamed, but maybe there can be a show of virtual hands somehow to show how many of you have ever met a clinician scientist who goes by that title or label. I'm not sure if that's an option. All right, well, put a thumbs up or something if you have. Without sounding idealistic, this is largely how I organically came to be in this role, is that I do see research as a way of pursuing truth and justice in medicine. And it's really the ultimate vehicle for patient advocacy. And maybe as you move more and more into the clinical space, I see we do have some fifth and final year students, and COVID hasn't completely removed this opportunity, I don't think. You'll start to see that it might be the vehicle for patient advocacy that you're craving, and that it really does transcend traditional service-based roles. So it allows you to explore basic sciences, it allows you to treat patients at an individual level, to do health systems work, to pursue policy and guidelines building research, and really comprehensive, but it can also be tailor-made to your interests and expertise. So I'd like to disclose that I'm new to this role and I'm by no means an expert on being or becoming a clinician scientist, but it does bring me to the idea of what is a clinician scientist, and there's no singular definition. But ultimately, it's somebody who's clinically trained as a healthcare professional, but they undergo additional research training and they incorporate that research into their professional career. And that means often that this work is, or the research and clinical work are both funded. It's important to acknowledge this value, even if it's not always the case. And often this extra training is in the form of a PhD, or at least a master's. The role is definitely fluid, self-directed to a large extent in our context, and in some contexts, the research and clinical requirements are predefined in a contract even. For example, in the NHS, you get your programmed activities, your PAs are often outlined in advance of what's expected from you in terms of a research or academic output. At the other extreme, you have contexts where research is considered to be extracurricular, often unfunded and largely voluntary. And I'm sure you can imagine where South Africa fits on that spectrum, regardless, or at least at the moment. And regardless of the role regardless of the role that you occupy as a clinician scientist, I really think the benefits to your clinical acumen, critical thinking skills, the potential for patient advocacy, it really increases significantly when you embark on this kind of research and clinical journey. There are various avenues for research, and really you should tailor these to suit you, as I've said, and feel free to adapt and acquire new skill sets as you go along. So during the pandemic, what we saw is that clinician scientists were really the people with the insight and knowledge about how best to implement and respond to health system and patient level COVID-related problems. And they were able to interpret the effect of interventions like lockdown, for example, particularly with PWAD or trauma patients, on the health system. And they were able to interpret these in real time and respond rapidly to needs. As a clinician scientist, you may find that your contextual perspectives allow for rapid integration of research into practice and to really practice evidence-based medicine, which is not the abstract topic I think we might think it is at a book-based or undergraduate-based level. In surgery, for example, early on, the COVID risk score was developed locally to stratify the risk for patients to undergo surgery, and this looked at a facility's COVID risk score and a patient's score. And currently, we are validating that with the COVID Surgery data. The pandemic also showed us that various stakeholders really need to take ownership of the clinical space, and this includes students as well. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And if I reflect on my experience at Barra, which I was asked to as an intern in the first and second waves, and now as a ComSub in the third wave, and I worked briefly at Joburg Jane for a few months before the closure during the second wave. The typical clinical and research challenges and inefficiencies were really just compounded by COVID. And while it may have exposed issues, I'm not sure it created entirely new problems. I remember in the COVID surge study, it was so difficult to access patients' files because we couldn't go into the COVID ward. There were such strict rules. And we overcame this by including researchers from internal medicine to join the study. And really that promoted that collaborative and industrious thinking that you should be developing as a surgeon scientist. So I'm sure you've thought about the different tensions that might surround this kind of work, and what your priority as a doctor or healthcare worker needs to be in light of the massive burden of clinical disease, and that's often to deliver one-by-one patient care. And I think this is what I'd call a traditional need in South African medicine. At the same time, there's a tension within a field of research, and I call those research needs, and that's where you're competing for limited funding. And at the moment, that funding is being directed mostly, if not all, towards COVID. And really, some savvy researchers have thought of ways to link COVID to their typical interests in order to access this funding. And these are often conflicting, right? Then within the surgical fraternity, we confront entrenched clinical cultures. And by that, I mean you'll probably encounter more and more as you enter the clinical space that there are solidified and often outdated views about research being a softer career path, or that one's neglecting their clinical responsibilities by doing research. And I don't think that's true at all. Lastly, you need to balance a sense of personal and professional fulfillment with all of these tensions. And I truly believe that you should pursue a career path that makes you happy at least once, if not all the time, every day. Let me leave it at that. As a clinician scientist, you're be able to turn all these opposing forces inwards and redirect these arrows, I guess, to a central cause, and amalgamate them into a fulfilling career. Or at least that's what I'm hoping. So to be a clinician scientist in South Africa, I think to an extent you need to be prepared to pioneer your own career path, but also to acknowledge that you definitely can't do it alone. And I was asked, to touch on my journey in academic surgery, and really I'm grateful to say that I've been on a non-linear journey in medicine, and I've pursued areas of interest without any vested interest. And I've been lucky to have the opportunity to really pursue an area of work where all my passions converge. And I'm grateful that I was given the opportunities to teach myself some of the skills that were needed to start this journey. And really, I'm at the start of this diverging path. There are three combined starting points to my personal journey. And the first is that I would not have been able to pursue this career without exceptional mentorship. And this is probably my key take-home message for all of you, is to get familiar with the practice of mentorship then. So what is this? What is this concept of mentorship? So a mentor can provide you with personal or professional guidance. They provide you with support that really can enrich your professional career. And I think it's important that upfront you define your roles and responsibilities, you define your expectations and deliverables on both sides, and to always be honest in that mentor-mentee relationship. There's also different categories and types of mentors, and you may find you need more than one to address different areas of your personal and professional life. And I really came to this concept of mentorship, or at least in a formal sense, quite late in my medical school career. And it was really the first time I consciously thought about the topic was at an international meeting. And I think that's where another downside of COVID has been that, as Prof. Brand mentioned, that opportunity to network has really been diminished. Secondly, I engaged in collaborative research quite early on, in multi-center international prospective cohort studies. For me, that was what I first encountered. And they were really wonderful because they introduced you to research, leadership, logistics skills in a really not risk-free, but low-cost kind of way. So it was really a fun and safe environment to learn about research. And thirdly, I identified the different skills, and these are complex, that would be needed to pursue this career. I'd like to take this opportunity, even though they're not in attendance, to thank the various entities that have made this career path possible for me, and hopefully for all, if not most of you in the future. Firstly, the South African Medical Research Council, who recognized the need for validating this dual career path I've been chatting about, of clinician scientists in Africa who support my work. And they're really promoting early career scientists through scholarship funding and other grants. And that allows us to complete institutional clinical training as well as clinical research simultaneously. The Department of Health, who support my current post, and without whom I would not be able to have occupied or transitioned into a full-time clinical research job where my overtime is clinical and my day job is to do research. At Wits University, of course, for supporting my academic and clinical training, and most importantly, my mentors and supervisors, who are Prof. Martin Smith, Prof. Maria Papathanasopoulos, and Dr. Mary Kawanga. Because of all of these investors and supporters, I've been able to transition into this path. So what are some challenges you might face as an aspiring researcher, besides robots? So there's always the training burden. And as a student, intern, ComServe, registrar, fellow, I think first and foremost, your responsibility is to your patients if you're doing any kind of clinical work. And the way to really honor this commitment is to have the integrity to study hard and try to be the best clinician you can be from early on. You really don't study for tests, you study for patients. And this new prerequisite of self-directed learning from COVID, I really don't think it's a bad thing, because as Prof. Brand said, it really will weed out people who aren't motivated or committed to pursuing this really wonderful and fulfilling career. Really, the earlier you adopt this ethos, I think it becomes much easier to navigate the clinical space in general, not just if you do research. And I also don't think you can do meaningful research without sound medical knowledge. At least I don't think so. So I touched on this idea that the career path is not mainstream yet in terms of fraternity challenges. And again, hard work, honest work, showing integrity is really the only way I can see to overcoming this. And of course, the role of your mentor comes in for guidance and to add credibility to your pursuits. In terms of funding, well, let's just say it took me a while to even think about spending the grant money or my scholarship grant rather, because I was so used to doing research work voluntarily. And I think it's not a problem that early on, especially as a student, you will do this work voluntarily because you're probably gaining more than the person you're helping or learning from. But I think later on, sorry, that was my mistake, it's important to know your own work in this space. Then in the day-to-day challenges, ethics applications, and I think really there should be a conscious move to direct resources towards ethics applications, especially at my university. Sources of data, while there's been slowness, if not a failure, to adopt efficient data capturing practices, and that's a large focus of my work at the moment. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be electronic, just collectible, feasible, accessible. And COVID really has helped here with integrating technology into healthcare in South Africa even. And examples for that are DAFCOV, which the NICD's implemented to track COVID cases, and other trace and track apps. And they've also empowered patients to be actively involved in their care. And maybe that's where cancelling OPD visits hasn't been entirely bad, because we've been able to telephonically or sometimes via telemedicine means communicate and involve patients, make them stakeholders in this, not only the system, but their own health. And then collectability, which I've spoken to. So this is probably the slide you've all really been waiting for or are most interested in. And I really encourage you to take a moment now to try and compress all the other information I've shared about context and challenges and opportunities, and try apply them to the various options or opportunities I've laid out here on the slide. So the Wits Department of Surgery has established really robust research units, and we conduct clinical trials through funding made available by the NIHR Global Health Research Unit on Global Surgery. We do basic science research, there's health systems work that goes on, and there's clinical research, and we have local and international partners. And there really is something for everyone, and something for everyone at every level too. So I hope all of you choose to start developing your research skills or building an academic network early on in your careers. And I hope you will use research as a vehicle for achieving health equity in South Africa. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hyman. That was absolutely amazing, and thank you just for sharing your inputs on different types of things. I just have some questions, just for you regarding. I did write a nice big question prior to your talk, and you did answer it, but I might as well just ask it again, just for some students who maybe didn't listen properly. So, with COVID having such detrimental effects on the South African economy, how has the pandemic affected research funding? So what I asked was, have researchers had to look for international funding elsewhere? So I did see you mention the NHR. And yeah, so just in terms of that question, is there any other international funding places that you looked at, or did South Africa provide majority of the funding for your research and research in general in South Africa?
Great, thanks. That's a really good question. So I'll speak to the funding avenues that I'm aware of, because I guess that's all I can speak to. So my own research is funded through the South African Medical Research Council's Institutional Clinical Researcher Program. And this is a new program. So it was only launched last year in October, and there was quite a short period to apply for funding. But the funding was not incumbent on the research being linked to COVID, but that was required that the researchers were early clinician or aspiring clinician scientists, and that we remained in a clinical role while we did the research. And the university Wits undertook to support and facilitate this dual training. And this funding was the process to making the funding available and to really trial this program started before the pandemic. So in terms of my own funding, it is funded by a South African entity for my own research. That research is made available through the Department of Health, and there's buy-in and partnership from the Department of Health as well to facilitate this research. So from for my personal work, it's completely funded by the South African government for the value of the grant. In terms of the NIHR funding, which you touched on, that's a long-term grant that facilitates a hub on global surgery research, which is housed at the Wits Health Consortium, which is which houses many research entities at Wits University for various types of research, lab-based basic sciences, respiratory, child health. So that research, again, was made available before COVID and fortunately hasn't been affected by the pandemic. However, new funding, and I can speak to colleagues of mine who've accessed funding for various grant funding, was disproportionately directed towards COVID type research. So even in the space of public health, the way to access funding has been now to link your research to COVID or COVID-related outcomes. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's driven more by a big knowledge gap and an urgent need for understanding how the COVID pandemic has impacted health at various levels. Prof. Brand might be able to speak more to this at the level of working within an academic surgery department. But from my experience, that's been the major challenges, but also opportunities. So I'm fortunate that my work hasn't directly been affected by COVID because of long-standing commitment to this grant. But I imagine that other researchers have had to adapt their focuses to access grant funding. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. Yeah, personally, I also do research. I do breast cancer research, and it was quite hard to, especially I finished my protocol and I got my ethics clearance in the beginning. It was like in March 2020, just before we went into lockdown. So yeah, it was very hard for me to find fundings, but thank goodness my supervisor, pulled some strings for me. So yeah, I can definitely understand that a lot of researchers are going under quite financial stress in terms of their research. But yeah, thank you so much for answering that. You did answer my question. And then my second question to you was, what advice would you give an undergraduate student who wishes to be a clinician scientist? So how do you balance your time in the clinic and doing your research?
So maybe I could divide this up into 3 stages of your clinical career and then describe possible avenues for the parallel or joint research path. So at a student level, as I mentioned in my talk, the responsibility is truly first and foremost to your grades and to your marks, to passing, to developing that clinical acumen and knowledge that you require to navigate the clinical space as a clinician. I think your interests will make the time avail itself almost. So if you are interested in a particular kind of research, I think the time will organically follow and you'll learn to manage your time, your personal time rather, and balance your out of school or out of lecture hours to pursue both paths. And that's where mentorship really comes in earlier rather than later, where you'll be advised about how to achieve this balance and how to access funding at a student or undergraduate level. I think your student time is really an important time to develop basic research skills. So I can speak to the Wits program, and I supervised 3 GEMP projects. The GEMP research project is a really fantastic opportunity to get a taste of research, to learn how to develop a protocol, how to basic research methodologies. Maybe there could be more time devoted to learning some biostats. But I think that's your goal, your role as a student, and that's where, like I say, mentorship really comes in. As an intern, at the moment, your number one priority is to treat patients, and I think that really depends on where you work, what hospital you work at. So I believe that everybody should try and work at a hospital where, as an intern, you have a good amount of supervision, but you're really having exposure to great clinical exposure rather. And I mean, I loved every day working at Barra, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to go back. So I think that clinical skill is very important. And again, that same principle of having a mentor and making time for your research to follow is important. At a ComServe role, and this is really, we're trialing this concept of a clinician, scientist, community service role. And if there's hopefully there'll be more interest and more support. And I'll hope to show at the end of this year that it is a feasible and important job that needs to be funded to produce high quality research for the government and the health system of South Africa, but also to undergo clinical training at the same time. I can't speak directly to registrar or fellow time, unfortunately. Not yet. Does that answer your question? Basically, in summary, mentorship, don't neglect your clinical responsibilities, and feel free to ask for help and take advice so that you can develop your research skills in parallel to your medical and clinical skills.
Perfect. Yes, that does answer my question again. And then I have one last question directed at both you and Professor Brandt. It is quite a broad question, so yeah, I don't know how you would like to answer it, but it was just something that I know a lot of students were interested to hear about. And this is obviously before you guys did speak. So it was, with all the problems encountered in COVID in terms of our public health and educational system, what do you believe is the best solution to ensure the quality of our doctors coming out of our universities? You did give some amazing examples of what solutions are currently being used, but what do you truly believe will be the best solution in a South African setting? Yeah, so it's quite broad. I mean, but yeah, like even just a simple, maybe you believe it's virtual, you know, surgery, or I don't even know. But you know.
Prof. Brandt, do you want to go first?
I was languishing there and hoping you were going to go first. And I can follow up. That's an impossible question to answer, is what I think it is. We don't know. And that's what I was highlighting. Everything that we're actually doing at the moment is experimental. We're doing it by trial and error, but we're hoping that what we are trialing makes sense and the amount of information we need to get across is there. As I said, the real challenge is that you're not getting the clinical exposure at the moment, especially the final years. And that's a real concern. I mean, if we look at KZN, their final year medical students haven't gone back since the beginning of COVID. And now we are seeing interns that are coming from there, and they look very inexperienced, even though they have the knowledge, but they don't have the practical examination skills, etc. And it is a real challenge. The Department of Health and the Department of Education felt that when these students came to their intern years, that they needed to be supervised more. But the problem is that the pandemic continued, and it wasn't just last year's batch of students that were affected, it's this year's batch of students as well. And we don't know if next year's batch of students are going to be affected, kind of thing. And so now we're finding it challenging because now the interns who are with us as well are also not seeing as many patients as they should. So we don't really have a good answer. There's no replacement for a patient, a live patient. There's no replacement for seeing a live patient, for talking to a live patient. And that's really where the real challenges, and we don't really have a good answer to it. I can say what we're moving to in our university, I mean, we're busy with redesigning the curriculum, and we were going to do that anyway. But what it has done is we've had to start looking at what other universities overseas are doing to replace the lack of patient contact. But whatever we find at the moment is first of all, phenomenally costly if you start looking at the virtual mannequins and those kind of things. And yet, I mean, I've had a lot of opportunity in the last 6 months to demo these kind of softwares, but their experience is not the same as a live patient, and they're nowhere near a live patient. So I think my advice would really be that you do need to make the most of every opportunity that you get. And we can clearly see that at the moment in our student exams. You can clearly see the students who've gone out of their way to find that extra patient to examine. You may be allocated to a unit for that week or 2 weeks or however it works in your rotation, but that unit may not have that many patients, whereas there may be a patient with obstructive jaundice in another unit. It's going and finding out about that, talking to each other and saying, hey guys, we've got really cool abdominal mass, come and have a look, or hi, we've got a really cool AAA, and sharing that kind of information. So it's collaboration as well amongst yourselves, which you've never really needed to do before. So yeah, it's challenging, and that's why I said it's in your hands. Actually, a lot of it, we can only provide so much. It's up to you to say, right, I know I'm not getting enough exposure. I need to go find some extra patients. So then walk between 396 and 395 and 394 and look for them. Just because you're not in that ward doesn't mean you can't go examine those patients. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Your turn.
I agree. Yeah, look, I completely agree with everything Prof. Brand said, and I just, in the same way that COVID exacerbated, it didn't create new problems. It just exposed every other weakness in the health system that we have. It also exposed every weakness we had in the medical training system. So it's just that spectrum is much more dichotomous now. They're the students who work hard and the students who've always worked hard, and I maintain that the student who works hard is the intern who stays until all the work is done, and is the reg who stays to finish their post-call list and will help everybody around them, and the consultant who's there on time before the crack of dawn for the morning round. And I think that ethos of, having integrity and really caring about having pride in your work is something that maybe can't be taught at medical school, or maybe with less exposure, it's harder to acquire that ethos because you're not seeing it in practice. But I think it's really that simple. Whatever the medium is that we deliver medical training, the medium we offer research training through, or research opportunities, whether it's funded or unfunded, if you are motivated and like it really comes down to having the integrity or pride in your work to work hard, it's going to have the same outcome. So it's really a vacuum for people who are committed to really excel, and it's a very sad downfall of the people who don't put in the extra miles, maybe taken away the option for mediocrity a bit more. But it's medicine. You have to work hard. It's a difficult job, but important and rewarding, and patients really rely on you. And however you deliver that service to patients, I think the harder you work, the better that input. So that's a bit of an idealistic answer to your question. But I guess it doesn't matter if robots do the surgery or not, as long as they come to work on time and they don't need earliest. It shouldn't matter. They're as good as us.
Perfect. Thank you so much both for your inputs. Yeah, I think it's essential both what you said. And just with that said, I'm going to hand over to Miyuri, and she's just going to wrap up everything. But thank you so much for your answers. I'm sure they did resonate with the majority of the students who have joined. But thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Michael. I would like to conclude tonight's lecture. Firstly, I would like to, on behalf of all organizations involved, express my gratitude towards Professor Brand and Dr. Hyman for accepting our invitation and also taking the time from your very busy schedules to present today. Both presentations were engaging, informative, and I think they've inspired us all to further explore the field of surgical research. I would also like to thank the Tuks Undergraduate Research Forum and the Wits Student Surgical Society for accepting our event proposal, as well as for diligently planning to make this lecture a reality. Finally, I thank the attendees, and I hope that you have found this event to be meaningful and worth your time. Good night, everybody.